Thank you.
But what's interesting for us is to understand the context of Alexander's heritage in a way, because both his parents and grandfather were artists by profession. His father, Sterling Calder, and grandfather, Alexander Milne Calder, were both celebrated sculptors in their own right, and his mother, Nanette Lederer, was a painter who studied at the Académie Julian in Paris. So could you give us an insight into what role they played in shaping your grandfather's artistic career?
Well, these two artists had really an extraordinary effect on their child, because they led what it's hard to understand what the bohemian lifestyle was then. It wasn't that life was easy; it certainly wasn't. It's that they chose a different kind of path, and they always made sure their son had a workshop, so they could give him a place in the basement, give him some tools where he could work on his own projects, independent of them. They weren't hovering over, they weren't helicopter parents. And they just allowed him to evolve his own ideas and his own methodology. One of the most extraordinary things about his childhood is that we have evidence of his creativity, that his parents kept these things that he made. In the show, there are two. Has anyone here seen the show yet? That's about a third of you. Okay. So we can talk a little bit about what's in the show. In the beginning of the exhibition, there are these two animals he made as a boy. They're not toys. They're actually formal sculpture that he made for his parents for Christmas in 1909. And they're extraordinary objects in the way that they're crafted. He took a flat sheet of brass and drew geometry on the brass, preconceiving multi-dimensional, three-dimensional, and four-dimensional activity, cutting it out with snips. He couldn't make a mistake, couldn't go backwards, folding it up, sort of like origami, and creating this dog and this duck. And the dog is static, but the duck rocks on its belly. So it's the first kinetic work of art that he made as a child. It's really incredible.
It's actually brilliant work, the way that it's folded inside and outside. Conceptually, it's quite a brilliant idea, that one object.
Yeah. I mean, he's a kid.
I know. 11. Did you say 11?
Well, honestly, we don't know if he's 11 or not. But it's...
Oh, our label says he's 11. So
well, it was published in Calder had a big retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1943. And in that catalog, it's published as 1909. But my grandfather's biographer, Jed Pearl, who's now working on the second volume of this multi-volume biography, has a different theory about, things are a little later. Maybe he was 12 and not 11.
But it does show that his talent is valued at a very young age. So what's that transition from those early works and sort of nurtured, having his own space, to becoming an artist that at a young age moves to Paris? How did that transition happen? Yeah,
kind of awkwardly, actually. He was so creative. He wasn't very sporty, and he ended up, his parents didn't want him to suffer. Like, they had suffered, they continued to suffer as artists. They chose this path, and they were happy with their lives, but they suffered. And he got this idea that he should go to university, and one of his friends was going to study mechanical engineering. And so he thought he'd go. He didn't even really know what that was. He decided to go study mechanical engineering too. But we shouldn't make the mistake to suggest that Calder was an engineer who then became an artist. That's part of the dialogue, or part of the lineage that people write about, which is not true, which is that, he was this engineer who became an artist. And he said that he would have made mobiles even if he hadn't gone to engineering. The engineering had nothing to do with the mobile making process. And when I would sit with him in his studio and he would work, his process was completely intuitive. People think he calculated and got out the slide rule and made all these calculations. And that wasn't at all how he created. He cut out shapes in certain different harmonics and stitched them together, balanced them just by the intuitive process, not at all by any kind of weights and measures.
But he's gone to Paris, which he's seen in his family through his mother. So it's happened, there's a lineage of this occurring, because you're talking 1920s, heading to Paris, mid-20s I think it was. He goes
26,
goes to Paris, and this kind of changes his life, doesn't it? As a network that kind of informed his career for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
This is a really formative period.
Well, after university, he does a couple of jobs. He's like sells rototillers and does these different things. And he's a timekeeper in a lumber camp on the West Coast. And eventually he writes to his mom and asks her to send him some paints. This is 1922, so he can paint while he's out there. And we have 2 paintings that exist from that time, which is amazing. And then he just decides he's going to move back to New York, be an artist full time, finally commit to being an artist. And then he's in New York, goes to the Art Students League, and studies under his father's friends. His father's teaching at the Art Students League in New York, and then John Sloan and George Lukes and these other Ashcan school artists, or once he studies under. And then finally he goes to Paris. And everyone went to Paris. So Paris was a pretty obvious choice. It was inexpensive, it was extraordinary, and his parents had spent a lot of their formative years there. So Paris became the place to go, the place to be.
So could you share with us some of the people that he ended up, identifying with and who kind of helped inform his practice at that time?
Yeah, well, in Paris, the art community was actually very small. So all those famous artists we know of, like Piet Mondrian and Fernand Léger and Pablo Picasso, everybody knew each other. You might not have really liked somebody necessarily, but you'd say hi. You'd sit down at a cafe and have a chat. Calder and Picasso weren't great friends, but they knew each other, and they crossed paths a number of times. We have a show right now, actually, in Paris at Musée Picasso of Calder and Picasso, which is an extraordinary, interesting, very focused show. It's not about who influenced who, it's about both of these great artists during their entire lives and careers dealing with the void, dealing with this space, empty space. In Picasso's case, it's the anxiety that he projected and put in every portrait. Every portrait is a self-portrait in Picasso. Every image he painted was his own attitude, emotion, anxiety. And Calder took all of his energy and externalized it. He didn't want to share his bad days. He didn't think that, he thought life was tough enough, Calder. He just thought he should try and help improve people's lives.
So who were the artists that he was closely identifying with in Paris?
Fernand Léger, Georges Braque, Joan Miro, Pablo Picasso, all those guys, Kurt Schwitters. I mean, pretty much any artist you can name that was working in Paris, Fujita, like all these different artists, he knew everybody. Noguchi was there in Paris, and Noguchi when Calder would perform his circus, Noguchi would spin the records. He'd be the DJ.
Amazing.
While Calder was performing his circus, this kind of friendships.
And when did he actually meet his wife?
What are you supposed to do about these slides, though?
Well, that was my hint.
Oh, yeah, okay. So we're going to burn through a few of these pictures. So this talk doesn't really relate to these slides, but that's cool. So this is my grandfather in 1936 at his house and his studio, what we call the Ice House studio, was later burned down in Connecticut, in Roxbury, Connecticut. That's just the first picture. But then here he is, a boy on the West Coast in California. That's around the time he made The Dog and the Duck. So that's why there's a picture here. That's a self-portrait in the exhibition. A lot of these pictures are works in the exhibition. And here he is. He actually draws his tools. You can see he's holding a saw. There's a drill press at his feet there, and a hammer and pliers. And really fantastic little drawing. There's the duck we were talking about. Oh, we get all caught up here. This is good. Can you see the pencil lines in the arc of the belly? They're still on the duck. You can actually see where he was drawing and understand that he drew it flat and then and bent it and folded it and so on. This is in Paris. This is a photograph by André Carthez where he's getting ready to perform his circus in 1927 or 8.
You want to talk about the wire sculptures because
Yeah.
there's so much interest in these wire works.
Yeah.
People know the mobiles, but increasingly I think they're debating and just the beauty and the simplicity of these wire works.
Yeah. The show has some extraordinary wire works. So wire seems pretty normal stuff these days, but in the 20s, when my grandfather invented sculpting in wire, nobody sculpted in wire. There was no such thing. So taking a line and drawing in space, especially three-dimensional volumetric drawings but had no mass, was considered really irritating. In the 20s, and artists said that's not sculpture. That has no mass. But it's not drawing. It's not sculpture. It's not choreography. So what the hell is it? And Grandpa started calling his works objects, so he didn't have to defend himself as to whether this was sculpture and even whether it was art. These images are two portraits of Josephine Baker, the great performer and singer and vaudevillian even. The one on your left is on the wooden base is the first one he made, and the one on your right is the last one he made of 5 different portraits over about 4 years. I like the comparison because the last one on your right is suspended, so it hangs and it rotates, it moves. The whole point is this is where the ideas for the mobiles start to come from. All of the different parts of her figure, her wrists, her feet, her ankles, everything is articulated. So it all moves and jiggles and vibrates. It's very, very active. Where the earlier one is quite static. It's still a drawing in space, but it has no particular motion to it.
But this is one of the greatest challenges.
But I got a call. Hold on a second.
That was me.
Oh, it was you.
One of the greatest challenges for a museum to be presenting this work is the fact that originally the intent of movement is often impeded by a museum because of age, conservation, just sort of museum conditions. So we're not always able to convey that original intention, which I understand would have to be a frustration at times when you're curating a show around Calder.
It's totally frustrating because when you put a wire sculpture in a space where it can't be, when you can't get near it, when you can't feel that it's actually vibrating, without touching it even, it's actually vibrating. And so when you look at this rearing stallion here, it looks like a line drawing. And when you see it in space, it still looks like a line drawing. You don't understand that there's a 4th dimension going on. With all of the wire sculpture, they vibrate. And of course, he made this to go in somebody's house. And if it's in your house, you'd pluck it once in a while, and it would vibrate. It would move, and it's that vibration which later becomes the subject matter when he gets rid of the figure. I think I have a couple more of these. This one's 9 feet long. It's a she-wolf with the two boys. This is Romulus and Remus, which is the famous sculpture in Italy, and this is Calder's version of it. So when he was starting making wire sculpture, it was so controversial and it was so radical that people didn't really understand what was going on, and so he decided to make a few sculptures about classical subjects. So he did Hercules battling the lion and Romulus and Remus, and every sculptor knows the sculpture of Romulus and Remus, so he did his version of it as a way to sort of, I think, explain what this new medium was. This goldfish bowl, which is not in the exhibition, has a crank on the lower right, and if you turn don't turn the crank, but if you were to ever see the crank being turned, then the goldfish, they don't just go bank, 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 bank. They have this amazing fluid motion, really extraordinary motion. The 2 little fishies do swim together in this goldfish bowl, and it's one of the earliest mechanized works. He made that for his mother for Christmas. It's continued to be. He was very consistent in giving his parents gifts of his works of art. They were very responsive. I put this horse in here. This is a chevalier, a guy riding a horse. The horse is rearing up. It's similar to that earlier stallion, and it's just a way to kind of illustrate how he's breaking away from the illustrating the figure to more of the gesture that's going on. This is about 2 years apart. The one with the black base at the National Gallery in Washington is a rearing stallion, has lots of details. And the other one is about the gestural lines and sort of the animation. It's kind of a study of its motion more than the details of the character. Yeah. So these are a few sculptures where the body is broken down. You can see the acrobat at the top is really just 2 lines of wire. It's about the vectors of energy, the vectors of line of motion, and a year earlier he would have given it much more detail.
But it's astonishingly successful, isn't it? The simplicity of those lines is so sophisticated and powerful.
Tony saw this sculpture in my office when he came to visit some months ago. The use of thick and thin wire here is suggesting different types of energetic forces. All of these become subjects for the mobiles when he becomes abstract. That's why I'm showing them here. And then, of course, the base itself is somewhat of an abstract painting if you look at it from the top, because he quickly starts to make paintings like this. This is when he's fully abstract. This is October 1930, and he makes a couple of dozen paintings in different vocabularies. So here he is at this transitional moment. One of the abstract paintings, also with this bull, which is sheet brass, one sheet of brass, just like the dog and duck, but later in life he's made this very complicated bull, all twisted and wound up. This is his Paris studio in 1930. And the box he's sitting on becomes the base for a mechanical sculpture. It's really this incredible picture, like everything, we can define everything in the picture. Do you want me to tell the story about Pete
really
Mondrian?
Easy for me. Keep going. Yeah, go for it.
I'm making your life easy, I know.
Yeah, I love it.
So you might have noticed that these paintings are very, very rigorous, right? They're very simplified. And this comes at this moment. So Calder has performed his circus in his studio, and Pete Mondrian has come to the performance and thought it was incredible. And Marcel Duchamp came, and everybody came. And Mondrian said, come by my studio and come for a studio visit. And Calder, of course, already knew the paintings of Mondrian, these rigorous dish steel abstractions, but he had this extraordinary epiphany when he went to visit the studio. He walked into the studio, and it was flooded with light. It was a 5-sided room, a very eccentric space, double a height and a half, and light coming in from 2 sides. And the whole space, every single object in the space, the pipe in the ashtray was turned, so when you walk through the door, you'd see the profile of the pipe. Everything had intention. And Calder had a shock, and that's his word. He was really shocked that this environment could be a work of art. Of course, Mondrian didn't intend this to be an installation. It was just how he was careful about his space. But Calder really felt that this was an activated work of art, and it really gnawed at him. And on the back wall of the studio were these cardboard rectangles of color, blue, red, yellow, but also white and shiny white and matte white and different off-whites. And Mondrian used those as compositional experimentation. He would pin them up and move them around. And my grandfather said, you should make those oscillate. So colors, rectangles, oscillating in a space of light. We start to really, you see a mobile immediately. That's what he's talking. He doesn't know he's talking about that, but that's what he's talking about. And then Mondrian, of course, is really super irritated that this young guy was telling him to make his paintings move. He said, my paintings are already very fast. So Calder went on his way, and then he went back to his studio and he made these paintings. And some of them, like the ones before, you sort of see a Mondrian influence, and then there are these weird ones. This is more like an American abstraction, like Arthur Dove or something. After 2 weeks, he makes abstract work. And it's as exotic as when he was making the wire portraits. Now he's made it even more difficult because not only are they drawings in space, but they're drawings in space that don't mean anything. The title of this is Sphere. It's called Sphérique 1, Sphérique number 1. And you see the base is sort of like one of those paintings. But what is this about? It's very, very difficult to understand what he's trying to express. This is one of the final paintings. It's just a line into the light and back into the shadow on a gray background. Very, very severe. And here's a sculpture he made right after. You see the thick and thin wire, just like in circus scene, delineating heavier energy or more voltage or something, who knows?
What date are we talking?
1931. This is 1931. These works, the first sculptures, were exhibited at Galerie Percier in Paris, and it was really exotic. I mean, people, here's the exhibition, people didn't understand at all what was going on. And it's not even that Calder was an abstract artist, it's that he was a non-objective artist. And I said this in a talk in New York a couple months ago, where Jed Pearl, the biographer I was mentioning before, he was sitting next to me. He looked at me like, what are you, crazy? Of course Calder was an abstract artist. I said, no. He was a non-objective artist. An abstract artist takes a known image and takes a piece of it or something, a line, and makes a painting out of it, like Ellsworth Kelly or somebody like that. And Calder, these are not known subjects that are then reduced and refined and abstracted. These are non-objective. They have no subject. And if they don't have any subject, how do you act? It's not a pretty picture of something, and it has no meaning, and has no subject. What is it?
Non-objective.
Here's one of those same, from 31, one of those abstractions. You see the crank again. At the bottom, you turn that crank, and the two spheres within the bigger sphere, they don't gently, harmoniously move. They bang around inside and outside of the sphere. Very awkward, jerky motion. Oh, look at that, I've compared them, that's nice. A crank and a crank. So that's 2 years apart in development. Clearly it's, a wild shift. One of the things that Calder and Picasso too, one of the things these two guys did was they kept annihilating their prior work. So here Calder has killed off. He invented wire sculpting. He did it for about 4 years. He stopped doing it, and he's just killed it off completely and moved on to non-objective art. That's wild.
It's often the mark of a great artist, though, isn't it? To have the confidence to continue to push.
And then he's not pandering. He's not, he doesn't make a bunch of sculptures. Oh, this one sold well, make 6 more of those. Yeah. He just, he liked making money. That was fine, but that wasn't at all his motivation. This is in the exhibition. It's one of the most extraordinary works in the exhibition because of something you can't see. So I'm going to describe it. You understand that the red sphere is a solid wooden ball, actually. The black sphere is 2 discs that he's intersected 90 degrees. So it's the implication of solidity. And then the black line is a rod, a 2-dimensional rod, right? It's flat, but it implies a 3-dimensional sphere. So it's 2-dimensional representation. So it's 3 spheres of different attitudes suspended. His idea was that the white would melt into the background of the wall and you'd see 3 objects floating in space. Obviously, it's like a mobile. He hasn't invented the hanging mobile yet, but he's really, really close. The most important thing, though, is the radical aspect of this is that if you can see you can all see the white rod at the top, the horizontal rod. So the red ball and the black ball, you can slip them right off that rod. They're not fixed, and there's no notch, there's no position. You can slip them off, and then the post coming down is just sitting on a pin. So the white rod can rotate anywhere in 360 degrees, and you can put the red sphere and the black sphere back on the rod in any organization that you want to. So it's up to the viewer to determine the final composition. It's about intervention. It's the first time in art history that an artist says, the work is complete, but it's not finished, and I'm inviting you to finish it. And once you've finished it, you can leave it like that for a day, a year, 10 years, or you can come back tomorrow, change it again, and finish it again. It has multiple possibilities. That's crazy.
Very contemporary today. It's interesting.
Yeah. So these are just some pictures to show how you can recompose it. And I always get, when I give a tour at the Calder Foundation and this object is there, invariably somebody asks me, but what's the right composition? Well, what was Calder's right or preferred or, there wasn't one. It's hard to believe.
Terrifying thing about going to your foundation is that you make all the works move. He has a stick where he can make all the mobiles move and everything.
Wait a second, I'm not whacking on them like that.
For a person trained to never touch an artwork, it is quite interesting, though, because you are reading Calder in a completely different light. As soon as they start to animate, you start to really understand that original intention. And it's quite a moving, literally, experience to see
good
that.
One.
I know. What was?
Good on you.
What was intended? Because we can't do that, though, can we? We can't convey that.
And that's our biggest frustration: is how do you present Calder the way he intended and still protect the works of art? And it's really, really a challenge. We try and your museum, by the way, is incredible. You've got that ventilation in the floor. You probably all hated it before now, but it's great. It's the first time we've ever had that. We always have a discussion about should we hide some fans somewhere to just give circulation, to gently move things. Of course, when you have your thousands of people, everything really moves anyway.
But our brilliant curator did turn it up 5% to make it move even more.
Thank you, Miranda. That's good. Only 5%?
What's this photograph about?
Okay, so here the Calders have moved back to America. They've been living in France for, sort of off and on for 7 years. And it's 1933. Of course, Hitler's coming to power. My grandmother actually has a miscarriage in France, and she feels very unsteady, unsafe, and she wants to move back to America to actually start their family. And they move back to America, and they hunt all over for a house, and they buy this dilapidated wreck, which is a house from 1760 in Connecticut. And that's my grandfather, my skinny grandfather. He's bought this house, and he's fixing it up with his own hands. He doesn't have much money, so he has to do the work himself. And on the left of the image, you can see there's sort of a barn, and that's what becomes what we call the Ice House Studio. That's his first studio that he's owned. It's a dirt floor with a fireplace at the end. So that's it. When he bought it, it was a place where the farmer, these were all little dairy farms in Connecticut, So he had about 18 acres. And the farmer would go to the pond and cut ice out of the pond in the winter and store it in this building in straw. So all summer he'd have this coolness to keep a cool place to keep the milk. Very simple technology. And this is the studio as it became. This is 1934. So within a year, this is what the studio looked like. This is in your show. This is black frame, made in that Ice House studio. Unfortunately, it's not running with a motor, but you can understand that it's a little kind of theater with these three objects that move. There's a red sphere that goes around. There's a white disc that flips over and turns yellow. There's white and yellow, and there's that white helix that appears to be rising as it's slowly rotating. And interestingly, early on, people were trying to capture in photography a sense of what the motion or the vibration was all about. We have a lot of photography like this, these multiple exposures or blurred images to try and give a sense of what it was like to stand in front of the sculpture. And still today, you can't understand these works from the internet or from a book. You have to actually physically, be in front of it. But I'm talking way too much, Tony.
No, you're not. Keep going. This is
Okay.
perfect. I'm keen to get onto the depiction of the kangaroo and the other work in Australia. There's some interesting.
Okay, that's a ways away. Let's go. This is in your show. This is White Panel, 1936. This is Calder finally coming to the end realization of what he said to Mondrian in the studio about making those colors oscillate. And these mobiles in front of panels are about, here it is in its first exhibition in 1937, about a painting that's changeable, mutable. And below it is Tightrope, also in the exhibition. There's Tightrope.
Beautiful work. Very elegant and refined. This is in the grey, its own little grey box as you come into the first space.
Here he is with the Devilfish, which is in that little transitional space where the movie is in the show. He's just completed it. It's still got tool marks on it. He hasn't painted it yet. That's his first exhibition, also 1937. Same exhibition. Okay.
That's not a kangaroo.
But owning land is challenging. So my grandfather bought a couple of goats. He did the worst thing ever. He put them on chains and moved the stake every once in a while so they would eat circles and try and beat the bush. I mean, they're really good at eating all the crap, but it's not nice for the animals.
Very happy.
It's cheaper than putting up a fence, so that's what he did. But here he is outside. He starts to make outdoor sculpture. This is a little later. This is 1938, possibly 39, and he's making sculpture for the outdoors, and he's inspired because he owns this little property, and he starts to make pieces in the landscape, which is really amazing. There's Black Beast in your exhibition also. Beautiful. This is his first show at the Pierre Matisse Gallery in New York in 1940. Just right as made.
So at this stage, commercially, he's successful.
It's sort of like this. So Pierre Matisse, his dealer, is the son of Henri Matisse, the great painter. And they don't have a loving relationship. They're a little bit antagonistic, but he's a great dealer. And Calder's kind of the only American he's showing, because he's really showing, his father's work and other Europeans. And, they're doing okay. But Matisse sells maybe 3 works out of an exhibition. So maybe there are 15 works in an exhibition. He sells 3. Calder lives for a year. And then the other 12 works went to storage. And of course, 2 years later, they weren't going to show the same works. So those works remained in storage. Yeah. And many of those works became estate works and are the basis of the foundation holdings. So even Black Beast, it was only shown a couple of times. But he measured the height of the gallery. You can see it fits in the gallery. It's obviously too big for the space even, but it's supposed to be a garden sculpture. So we would never put it outside, of course, anymore. It's too precious. But he thought someone would come along and buy it. It goes together with nuts and bolts. You take it apart, put it up in your garden. But he wanted to make it as big as it could, as big and bold as it could be. Well, this isn't the kangaroos either.
No.
This is his studio in 1941. This is the Roxbury studio, the new Roxbury studio. Let's see what's here. So that's his LaSalle motor car. This is the Depression is going on, and these big fancy touring cars, nobody wants them. Nobody can afford them anymore. They're worthless. So he buys one. This is a fancy car, but he uses it like a pickup truck. And then eventually it has a rag top. It comes a convertible, and eventually it catches on fire, but he still drives it. It's fine. And he always would leave the top down in winter anyway because he loved lots of air. Here it's all packed up with sculpture on his way to New York for his show of 1941 at Pure Matisse. That's transportation.
Amazing.
It's pretty much what it was like when we sent you things.
Yeah, that's right. No, they haven't changed much.
So you can see, in the back is Gamma. That's the mobile that opens the show. This is 1947, and now he and Pierre Matisse had a big fight, and they split up. And Calder went to work at, be represented by Kurt Valentine at the Buchholz Gallery, and that's the first show for Gamma there.
Stunning work.
There's Gamma, fantastic. Yeah.
So you see that through the window from Federation Court.
Yeah, the owner of the mobile is an incredibly generous lender, John Shirley. He's the largest Calder owner, private Calder collector anywhere, and he just loves to lend his work and loves to share. He doesn't have this attitude that he's got to hold on to everything. He's a wonderful man. And here we have Parasite, which is in your exhibition. And it's called Parasite, of course, because the little red mobile with its white counterbalance is living off of the gray counterbalance. And it has these very concentric circles of motion. It gets all tangled up, and then it begins very introverted, and then it goes out and becomes extroverted again and extended like that.
He has a signature palette too, doesn't he? It's a very kind of restrained palette. When you look at Calder, he barely deviates from, a limited palette of around 4 to 5 colors.
Yeah, but then you find bubblegum pink and other weird colors in there too. He, especially in the 30s and 40s, he used a whole spectrums of colors. It wasn't just the primaries. We think of him as using mostly primary colors,
We do, yeah.
but actually for his sculpture he used almost black exclusively. So there's a little bit of color here or there. Gamma is multicolored, which is fantastic. This is the mobile that's at the end of your exhibition, Mobile with a Hole. This is a photograph in my uncle's house in Sachet in France. So now the Calders have their house in France, and I love this picture because it kind of shows how a mobile should just be hung at home, and if you bang into it, that's okay. It's just a member of the family. It's just there. There it is. And obviously there are many piercings in the sculpture, but it's called Mobile with a Hole because that sort of second biggest element has a chunk bitten out of it, but then there's a wire that returns to delineate the form. And he's using wire, he's drawing in space again, just like the early period. So that is my grandmother's dressing table in Connecticut around 1940. And she just pins up the jewelry. There's a lot of great pieces of jewelry in your exhibition. That's her a little younger and a little older. Okay. That was it for the jewelry, apparently. Yeah. There's a little monumental sculpture. This is at the airport in New York. This was a commission for the International Arrivals Building in 1957. It's quite huge. And there's my grandfather working on a sculpture for UNESCO for Paris. These must all be related here. Here it is. It's called La Spirale because the mobile elements are all connected and they spiral up like that. And as the wind blows it, it just spirals around like that. It's still there in Paris.
This is interesting because he's starting to make monumental sculpture
Yes.
all around the world. And we were talking about him yesterday.
Yes.
The first artist really to be seen as a truly global artist.
Yes.
He's getting commissions in South America and places that had been unheard of previously for a Western artist. And he's really starting to do that in a really active way, including into Australia.
Yes. I think we have some of the Australian ones at the end here. So this is in your show. This is a Southern Cross. We are pandering to you.
Yeah.
You can see the cross, and I got to see the cross the other day at Uluru, which I looked up at the sky and wait, there's a cross in the it's Southern Cross. It's amazing. It was really fantastic to see it. So here's the large version. This is actually in Connecticut, at the house in Connecticut. This is called Trois Disques for Montreal. You can see the scale of it. I love that French truck down there at the bottom. I want one of those. I think they're so cool. And here it is. Here it is at Expo.
Was this his largest sculpture?
No. Well, it depends how you count. Heaviest, widest, tallest. And then there's some controversy about the actual dimensions of the final sculptures. So this was supposed to be 65 feet tall, but it was for Expo 67, so the organizers wanted it to be 67 feet tall. And
It's good attention to detail. I like that.
Calder thought that was ridiculous. I mean, he said, that's like because I'm 67 years old. Just thought it was silly. But then the question is it 67 feet tall or is it 65 feet tall? We never have been able to put a tape measure on it, so we're not exactly certain. Sometimes you'd go back to an earlier maquette. This is a work made in the early 40s called Morning Cobweb. And he converted, this is an intermediate maquette, and then the final version, which he did in 1969. So he went back in 69 to an earlier work, brought it forward, and said, I want to make this spiky sculpture, because he was doing an exhibition. This is at the Fondation Mag in Saint-Paul-des-Vence in the south of France. And that is the entrance to the museum building, the pathway. So you had to walk through his kind of Gothic construction here to enter the show. And if any of you know the José Luis Sert designed building, it has these two half pipes as the roof of the building. So these two curved forms, he wanted to have these two spiky forms in response to the two curvy forms of his buddy, who was the architect. This is Flamingo in Chicago. This is 1973. So here are a couple of maybe silly things or maybe not so silly things. He was invited by Braniff Airlines, which was like a new kind of airline. Before we had Virgin and all these different airlines that had schemes. How do you get people to fly your system? They came up with this idea of asking Calder, this great artist, to paint a jet. Now, today it seems kind of normal, but in those days, airplanes were only white or aluminum. There were no, and the insignia was on the tail. There was no such thing as a paint. Now Qantas has these like ridiculously painted planes, right? But in those days, to see this thing flying was like seeing a UFO. It was totally crazy. And you see that it says Calder above the door. It doesn't say Braniff. Braniff's name isn't anywhere on the jet either. It was really, really kind of wild.
Yeah.
And then BMW, said, hey, wait a second. We've got this racing car. And so it was kind of a one-off. They asked Calder to paint this car, and then it was in Le Mans 24-hour race, and it failed to finish. The engine blew up or something. But then they thought, well, let's get Andy Warhol to do one, and let's get Frank Stella to do one. And then they started this whole line of painted cars. This is the first one, 1975.
This is the one that was at Art Basel last week.
It was in Hong Kong. Yeah, you just saw it.
Yeah.
None of the other cars were actually raced. This was the only one that was actually in races, could have smashed up. They weren't thinking about the future of a program of painted cars when they commissioned this one. Okay, I threw this in gratuitously because that's me at the bottom, the little kid. That's my dad on the left, with my grandparents and my great aunt, Calder's sister, at a dedication. Even more gratuitously, this is a bark painting in Calder's house in Roxbury, Connecticut. The reason it's such a bad picture is it's in storage, and we only had a Polaroid to quickly scan and show you guys. There's this one and there's this one. And they're really fantastic. I grew up with these paintings, especially this one. I remember it since ever when I was born. And your curator was Judith Ryan, was telling me all about it. She just knew everything there was, where the pigment came from and why it could be dated to this and that and everything. She was incredible. Met her yesterday. That was really fun. So finally, sorry to hold you all till this moment,
Gotta go.
but now we can get busy.
I may have overhyped this, but I think it's fascinating.
So, yeah, and we know that Calder actually drew these from life, that he was at the zoo in New York and there was a kangaroo and he made these drawings. But we don't really know why he made so many damn kangaroos. He made lots of kangaroos, fantastic kangaroos. So this one actually hops, it has wheels and it hops and was used in the circus. This was made to be a production child's toy. So there was a time in the later 20s where really he didn't have any money. He was trying to sell his jewelry and trying to sell various things, and he was illustrating and trying to make a few bucks here and there. And there was a Serbian toy merchant who suggested he might do some of these mechanical toys. And a few different of his designs were actually produced. This is the fantastic kangaroo. It hops on those wheels and it slaps its tail as it hops along and you pull the string.
So interestingly, he allows this to go into production.
Yeah.
But when he's approached by Cartier and Tiffany, about his jewellery range and whether or not he would allow that to go into production. He
Yeah.
declines to do that.
Yeah, because, so Tony's just mentioning, so the jewelry is made by his hands, and the jewelry has the integrity of his sculpture. It's not designed. He doesn't draw it on a paper and then give it to a technician who, a goldsmith who then makes the jewelry. Everything's made with his own hands, so it has the energy imbued in it. That's really important to him. These are actually for children, where, the rest of Calder's work are not for children. This is for actually children, and he draws diagrammatic plans which then are executed by technicians and painted by others. This wasn't made by Calder's hands, and it was designed to be a production thing. He made some furniture, he made wallpaper designs, fabric designs, and other things in the 20s, trying to make a few bucks. So yes, when Cartier approached him to make editions of his jewelry, he said, not going to happen. Yeah. More kangaroos. Now, what is going on here?
They're having a tea, afternoon tea.
Now, is that a dingo up there? Or is that just a coyote?
Yeah, we'll stick with.
It doesn't look like a dingo, right?
Yeah, well, no.
But it is afternoon tea. Okay. This was, funnily enough, this was a birth announcement. One of his friends had a baby and sent a card announcing the birth, and he cut the card all up and sent it back like that.
That's good.
This is not a kangaroo. This is the model for the sculpture in Sydney.
Yeah.
It's called Cross Blades, and it's
Commissioned by Harry Seidler,
yeah,
we should mention. Yep.
yeah. We've all been to Australia Square in Sydney, right? That incredible building by Harry Seidler, whose daughter is eyeballing me right now. It's great to actually present this here. We've never shown it. We took it out of storage. We had to clean it, prepare it for exhibition. If you look really closely at it in the exhibition, you can actually see my grandfather's thumbprint. He picked it up while the paint was still wet, and it smudged his thumbprint in the paint. You can actually see it right there below the two arcs. There's a grayish spot, and we've turned it in the exhibition so you can see that just for fun. But there were also chalk lines and everything. Of course, we protect all the markings he did. So he made it, he cut it out, he made it from bits and pieces. As you can see, it's all sort of pieced together, and then painted it and then put chalk lines on it where he wanted to design the structure, meaning how to give it three-dimensional structure so it wouldn't, vibrate in the wind and be unstable. I think there's some pictures of the big one. Here we go. Okay. So that's Sydney. This is at the National Gallery. So you have another outdoor sculpture here. A really cool sculpture. It feels like in nature. All right.
Wow. Well, thank you. That's an incredible overview.
Especially the kangaroos.
Especially the kangaroos. Well, it's an incredible part of the practice that people don't recognise. So this is the moment to talk about it. So well done. Thank you. We've got a few minutes, and I wanted to invite people in the room to ask some questions if they'd like to. So if you'd like to raise your hand, we'll get a microphone over to you. Got someone just over here.
Do you have any stories that you remember your grandfather telling you?
Tony?
Heaps. Yeah, okay. I know, I'd rather hear yours.
Well, my family's very small, and we were always together. So it wasn't like I had this great Christmas holiday with my grandparents once, and I remember it vividly. I met Marcel Duchamp, and I remember that vividly. He was playing chess in Washington Square in New York, and the way I remember everything about it, the way he was posturing, the way he was seated. You have a vivid memory of an exclusive experience like that. But I think what I'd like to say about my grandfather is that not only is his work difficult to access and quite misunderstood, but as a person, unfortunately, he felt misunderstood. So by the 1950s, he was doing things, he was dismissing interviewers. So later he just wouldn't be interviewed anymore. But while he was still being interviewed, in the 30s it was fine, but then later it was very awkward for him to have to explain himself. He'd rather you just present yourself to the sculpture. And so one of the things he did was he was just sort of clown around. So almost all of the motion picture we have of him is him being a buffoon, And then we think, oh, Calder was always being silly and always partying, and that's not at all how he was. Very, very serious, intellectual person who, in his studio, he never had a studio assistant. He made 23,000 unique works of art in his life. He never had a person helping him. I mean, the monumental sculptures, of course, those 300 works were made with technicians, but he didn't play the radio. He didn't play music while he was working. I would be listening to public radio if I was working in the studio. Silent, except for the sounds of his chisel and his hammer, his tools. And he was very happy to have me in the studio, or the rest of the grandkids in the studio, if we were busy at work, if we were making things. But if we were there, as soon as we stopped working, we were kicked out. It's a place for work, a very, very serious place.
You want to? Yep.
There's no big chance to find out whether or not he really had an affair with James Joyce's daughter.
That's a great question, actually. The question is, did Calder have an affair with Lucia Joyce? Lucia Joyce was an exotic person, and now she's been kind of revived. There was a biography of her like 12 years ago or something like that, and so she's James Joyce's daughter, and she had emotional difficulties, and she thought that every time Samuel Beckett came by, it was to date her, as opposed to come to see her father, which is why he was coming. I happen to know this because James Johnson Sweeney, who's the family friend, who was Calder's great supporter, he was a critic and a curator. His son, Sean Sweeney, told me all of these stories about the Joyces and about Sam Beckett and so forth. So my grandfather was sort of hired, quote unquote, engaged to give Lucia some drawing lessons. He did it twice or maybe 3 times. He didn't have an affair with her. But I'm not surprised at all that there's notation in her diaries, oh, Sandy Calder is coming to take me, somewhere, somehow. But it's unfortunately not true. Neither unfortunately or fortunately, whatever, it's not true. Yeah.
Let's move on to the next question. It's getting awkward up here. Here we go.
Hello, Sandy. I think you mentioned that he attended the Arts Students League College, and I'm wondering whether he went there for drawing or sculpture.
We don't know of any sculpture, of him making any sculpture there at all. We know he took life drawing classes, he drew at night, he did a lot of paintings. We have a lot of those paintings. They weren't ever sold, so we have them. He did, one of the really nice things about the paintings is they're very free, but he paints New York at night. And why is that interesting? Because of electric light. The city's lit up with electric light. And there's this boom going on in the 20s. Crews are working 24 hours a day. Now, like in the Mideast, they build these buildings, right? 24 hours a day. 3 crews, 3 8-hour crews are working 24 hours a day building New York City. So Calder's out there at 4 o'clock in the morning with electric light going on, observing the construction, the digging down. He makes these paintings about all these different aspects of the construction. But there's no documented sculpture from that time at all. Lithography, printmaking, drawing. Yeah.
Any more? One more over here. Yep.
You were recently interviewed where you made a comment that in your family, play is a 4-letter word. I was wondering if you could perhaps expand a bit on that.
That was a misquote.
I've heard you say it.
I think I was quoted, that was just yesterday. When people exclusively talk about play and joy and this kind of lightness in Calder's work, you're taking a sliver out and disregarding his intellect. So what I was addressing directly was how many years ago I would hate this word play, and that actually Beth Turner, she had me come down to the University of Virginia, and she had this whole Calder symposium, and this professor there said, wait a second, play is an amazing, play equals innovation. And he got me started to think about how play is a kind of a magical word. And I thought about my own children, observing them, as the further quote is about building blocks, how a child builds a tower and it falls over, and the next time they build it, it's better, and the next time they build it, it's better, and they innovate, and they become more expert. And I've come to embrace it myself. The generation above me still doesn't like it too much, but it's really the kind of misunderstanding that Calder's this breezy artist. And also, you wouldn't believe how many emails we get per week at the Calder Foundation of, look at the Calder that's in our hometown, and it's this god-awful sculpture. It happens to be kinetic, and it's clearly based on Calder's principles or his attitudes, but it has no even energy or harmonic or anything. It's just a dead kind of thing.
But this has been the importance of the foundation and what you've really spearheaded. And many people around the world talk about your foundation as a benchmark because you've done so much to, address all the misconceptions and to make sure that the legacy is one that is really about respect and an informed approach to his work. It has been an incredible. You've been in the role now for.
Well, I started our family foundation 31 years ago.
Yes.
I was 10.
Yeah.
And it's been a long ride, actually.
But it's an incredible legacy, isn't it?
I really enjoy I invented my job, so I better like my work. That would be terrible psychology. No, I really owe a tremendous debt to my grandfather and what he's given all of us. I really take it as a tremendous privilege to work with his sculptures and all of his art on a daily basis. It's amazing.
Well, it's been an incredible privilege for you to share all of that, to share your collection, which is so cherished around the world, and for you with Beth and everyone else at Montreal to bring it to Melbourne. So thank you very much. Can we please give Sandy a big round of applause?
Thank you.